DanMachi's final arc of Season 2 didn't really do justice to the volume of the novel that it was adapting. It pretty much pulled an Arifureta and started to skip chapters and chapters of content. Content that not only would have expanded the world or given us context to crucial plot elements, but also entire scenes and events that are fairly important to know for the main arc of Season 3. Let me put it this way, the last 2 episodes of Season 2 covered Volume 8 of the novel, with the main overarching story being the war with Rakia. But only 2 out of the 6 chapters of this novel actually pertained to the war that we saw in the anime. The other 4 were completely independent stories specifically related to other familias and characters, all of which didn't make it into the anime, and all of which took place while Rakia was trying to invade. That was the only common element between them. Now, part of the reason why it was written this way was to mainly show how little of a threat the invasion from Ares actually was. They wanted to show that his invading army didn't affect the day-to-day life of the people of Arario at all. It's a point that is slowly made as we progress through each of the stories. Now, some of these stories are more important than others, which is why I'm only going to go into detail with 3 of them. I'll briefly mention the others as well, but honestly they're just not as important. So let's start things off with the chapter that relates closest to what we'll be seeing in Season 3. Let's begin. Chapter 5, The Town Girl's Secret. As Rakia continued with their attempt to invade Arario, everyday life continued as normal throughout the guild. What was more concerning to them was the rumors of monsters stealing equipment from the bodies of dead adventurers. This was the main topic of discussion that Bell overheard while he was there. It's not entirely important to know right now, but it does relate to stuff that's going to come later. In any case, the main focus of this story is actually Sira. She's the city girl in question here. So, we know from the beginning of the story that Sira had cooked and packaged all sorts of food for people that we don't know of yet. It's why when Belle came to find her at the tavern, she wasn't anywhere to be found. When Belle went to ask Lunoir where she was, she didn't seem to know either. All she could say was that Sira had the tendency to disappear for random periods of time. No one knew where she went, but she would always end up returning a little while later. So, because she wasn't here, Belle's next idea was to go see if she was at her home. But that's when he realized that he didn't even know where she lived. In fact, no one did. That wasn't all though. Aside from where she lived, not a single person could recall any sort of specifics with regards to what she did in her free time. Her private life was a complete mystery. Now, Belle was going to just leave it at that, but as he was wandering around the city, he just so happened to spot Sira out of the corner of his eye. Curious as to where she was going, he decided to follow her, eventually ending up at a church on Daedalus Street. For those of you that don't know, this was one of the poorer residential areas within Arario. It wasn't a place that you'd expect someone like Sira to be. So Belle decided to follow her into the church. When he entered, he was immediately confronted by a few children, followed shortly after by Sira and a woman named Maria Martel. Maria introduced herself as the caretaker of this church. It was a place that she set up to be an orphanage for the kids whose parents were adventurers that died in the dungeon. Now, the reason that Sira was even here was because she tends to use the children as a means to taste test her dishes, specifically the ones that she likes to give to Belle. But since Belle was already here, the 2 of them would have lunch together, play with the children, then walk through the gardens of the orphanage. It was as they did that Sira told Belle why she decided to get involved with these children. The truth was that the slum they were in was the very place that Sira grew up in. Just like the children of the orphanage, Sira didn't have a mother or father. She didn't even know what their faces looked like. The only person she remembered from her past was the old man who raised her in these streets. That being the case, she didn't want to leave these children to the same fate that she was left in. She wanted to be able to give them the same happiness that the old man had given to her. Now, as they continued to wander around the streets, Belle suddenly got this strange feeling that they were being watched. He did a quick scan of the rooftops to find that Alan Frommel was looking right at him. This was the vice captain of the Freya Familia. It was definitely rather strange for him to be there, but before Belle could even point him out, he quickly disappeared. So Belle didn't really think much of it, at least until what happened later that day anyway. When Belle and Sira had returned to the orphanage, the kids mentioned that a mysterious sound could be heard coming from the tunnels under Daedalus. When they went to investigate, a deep floor monster known as a barbarian appeared out of the shadows. This was a minotaur that not only wielded a sword, but also wore armor as well. It was a type of monster rated to be between level 3 and 4 by the guild, a monster that was typically only ever found in the dungeon's deep zone, the 37th floor and below. This was a place that Belle had never even been able to go to yet. So the fact that it was right here underneath the streets of Daedalus posed a much greater threat than anyone could even imagine. Belle did make an attempt to fight it, but this Minotaur was far stronger than any he's ever fought before. It easily overpowered him in pretty much every aspect, forcing Belle into a corner in which escape didn't seem possible. Right as he was about to get slashed, one of the kids diverted its attention by throwing a rock at it, causing it to charge towards them. Sure, this may have saved Belle, but now that child was in a position where Belle couldn't even rescue them. Belle knew that no matter what he did, he wouldn't be able to reach them. So instead it was Sida who rushed in to shield this boy with her body. Even so, if no one stepped in to stop the Minotaur's charge, then that just meant that both of them would die. That's when a single javelin appeared as if out of nowhere, striking the monster right in its chest and killing it on impact. This was the weapon of Vanna Freya, also known as Alan Frommel. When he came to retrieve his weapon, he scolded Belle for not being able to protect a single woman and child. He then looked towards Sida, did a slight bow with his head, and exited the tunnel. Sida didn't say anything in response, but she did have a slight smile on her face as she watched this top-ranked adventurer leave. Of course, Belle was very curious as to how these two came to know each other, but Sida simply played it off as him being someone that was a regular customer of hers, an answer that honestly would have worked had it not been for one small discrepancy. You see, the Freya Familia had been tasked with defending Arario from the Rakia invasion. Because of this, their entire Familia was currently stationed outside the city. So, for their vice captain to not be there with them, well, that was something that just didn't make sense to Belle. Sida was very clearly hiding something, but Belle chose not to pursue it any further. That's where the part with her and Belle comes to an end. There is, however, a little bit more to this story, though. Later on that night, Alan returned to the forward operating base that the Freya Familia was currently stationed in. When he arrived, Freya asked Alan how he liked his day off. He immediately began to complain that how since Sida had left the tavern, he was forced to guard her all day. As a result, he wanted Freya to tell her not to wander around as often, a request to which Freya could only laugh at. So clearly Sida and Freya have some sort of connection, something that's actually been alluded to throughout the first 2 seasons. Aside from that though, we actually find out that Alan and Anya are siblings. The only reason why we never see them together is because Alan had decided to cut all ties with her. This was something that Freya felt he should fix. So that was the end of Chapter 5. The next most important story was Chapter 3, a love song to a goddess of the forge. This was a story that mainly focused on wealth, and it also gave us the true reason for Ares wanting to invade Arario. So it's best to understand this story from the beginning. Ever since Wealth hit level 2, the blacksmith development ability that came with it had gone to significantly improve the quality of his work. So Wealth had been spending a lot of time in the forge making new items for his party, mainly a new katana for Mikoto and 2 Goliath robes for Lily and Haruhime. While on an expedition to the 20th floor, Wealth found himself to be confronted by a feeling of inferiority. The party he was with was currently stuck facing the Goliath on the 17th floor. Haruhime and Mikoto were supporting the group quite well, but Wealth wasn't really able to do much of anything. It was only after Tsubaki Kalbrand came in and helped that they were able to beat the Goliath. I mean, she was, after all, the level 5 captain of the Hephaestus Familia, a person that didn't really get along all that well with Wealth. In any case, Tsubaki wasn't someone that went on expeditions too often, so for her to be at the 17th floor all by herself was actually rather odd. She initially said that it was simply because she wanted to run wild in the dungeon, but really it's more likely that she just wanted to talk to Wealth. You see, Hephaestus had been pretty sad ever since Wealth left her Familia. She was lonely, and that loneliness was affecting the quality of her smithing. It was because of this that Tsubaki couldn't deny that the two of them shared a special connection. Although Wealth's was a bit more affectionate than Hephaestus's, the fact remained that they were close. So Tsubaki was trying to bully Wealth into coming back to the Familia. She stated that with the way he was now, he would never be able to reach the level of smithing that he wanted to, especially if he wasn't forging any magic swords. Had Wealth used his magic sword in the battle against Goliath, then Tsubaki's assistance wouldn't have even been needed. She was trying to say that his normal creations simply weren't good enough. In order to make this point clear, Tsubaki used her personally crafted katana to slice right through the short sword that Welf was crafting for Belle, thus highlighting just how far away Welf really was from where he wanted to be. She wanted to make him feel as if he'd never be able to reach that coveted Mastersmith title. And that's exactly what happened. Even long after the expedition in the dungeon had ended, Tsubaki's words still remained in his head. They haunted his mind as he walked around Arario, causing him to deeply reconsider his skills in the forge. As he did, Welf heard an all too familiar voice call out to him from the shadows. It was a voice that was soon revealed to belong to his father, Will Crozzo. Will was sent on a mission by Ares to bring Welf back to Rakia. He wanted to reclaim Welf's ability to forge magic swords. Sure, he still had Welf's father and grandfather to make them, but Welf's skills were particularly special among the Crozzo family. Not only were his magic swords far stronger than the norm, but they also didn't tend to break from overusage. They were swords that had once been used to make Rakia's army near invincible. So if Ares was going to reattain that same level of glory, then he needed to take back the power that allowed him to do so. That was the main purpose of the entire war. The 30,000 troops currently attacking Arario was all for the sake of drawing out as many adventurers as they could. That way Will and his group could infiltrate the city, locate Welf, and bring him back to Ares. This was the lengths that Ares was willing to go to reobtain the power that he had lost 7 years ago. If Welf didn't comply, then Will said that him and his companions would use their own arsenal of magic swords to wipe out Arario. Even though all of them should have been removed and destroyed, Will confidently stated that there were actually a total of 50 left behind. More than enough to cause a significant amount of destruction similar to that of what happened to the elves. I mean, these were swords that were capable of turning entire lakes, mountains, and forests to ash. So this was a threat that definitely couldn't be taken lightly, even if it was a bluff. With no other options, Welf agreed to gather all his magic swords and bring them back to his father. But when he went to the mansion, Belle found the way he was acting to be rather strange, leading Belle to follow him to the abandoned warehouse that he was told to go to. The thing is, Belle wasn't the only person to be following him. Once Welf had met up with Will at the warehouse, the entire Hephaestus familia appeared from the shadows and surrounded them. As it would turn out, Will and his companions had been leading themselves into a trap the entire time. This was mainly because the Loki familia had caught on to their plan. They found it strange that the war they'd been fighting on the outside had not yet reached a decisive battle. The longer it went on, the more obvious it became that Ares was trying to stall for something. As for what that something was, well, there was only a few logical options, Welf being one of them. So, because Welf was likely their primary target, the guild had ordered Hephaestus' familia to discreetly spy on him, which explains why Tsubaki had been showing up in places where Welf would never have expected to see her. The current situation now backed Will into a corner. Fortunately, his earlier threat was just a bluff though. He actually only had a single magic sword, which honestly is still a pretty big threat, but in comparison to Welf's, this one never stood a chance against it. This was actually the essence of what Will had been having to deal with ever since Welf was born. His entire life he'd been faced with the fact that he was an inferior smith in every way, a fact that Will could never come around to accept. So, in a fit of rage, Will began to argue over all the potential that Welf was wasting, eventually leading to a fistfight to break out between the two of them. This was an action that needed to be taken. It was the only way that either of them could express how they truly felt, and Welf wouldn't allow anyone else to interfere. Tsubaki, Belle, and even Hephaestus could only watch as the two exchanged punches. But because Welf was level 2, the fight essentially boiled down to a one-sided beatdown. Eventually, another person from the shadows had to step in and stop them. A person who we find out was Welf's grandfather, Garen. Garen was the one who taught Welf everything he knew. He was also the one who forced Welf to forge all those magic swords when he was younger. But that was something that he now very much regretted, especially after seeing just how much Welf has come to hate them. Even though he too was ordered to bring Welf back to Ares, Garen ultimately decided to ignore those orders and instead respect Welf's resolve. He willingly gave himself and the others up to the Hephaestus familia, vowing to start the Crozzo family anew as blacksmiths. He would break off the ties they previously had as a noble family that only crafted magic swords. Instead, they would build themselves a new name from the ground up, just like how Welf was doing. Now, when all was said and done, Hephaestus took a moment to talk to Welf alone. It was here that Welf decided to ask if his approach to becoming a master smith was wrong. You see, Tsubaki's words were still lingering in his mind. Although Hephaestus couldn't deny the validity of what Tsubaki had said, she also couldn't deny the determination that Welf had established in order to reach his goal. They were words that went to dispel any doubt that Welf previously had, allowing him to recommit himself to surpass Hephaestus in the way that he felt was best for him. Whatever path that may turn out to be, Hephaestus was more than happy to encourage him along. It was after this that Welf brought up the topic of her being lonely. As it turns out, this wasn't something that birthed out of any particular special feeling. It was more so out of intrigue to see the smith that Welf would become. Sure, this may not have been the response that Welf was hoping for, but for him to learn that his goddess had such high expectations of him, well, that was one of the highest compliments that he could ever receive from her. She even went on to mention how she would have rewarded him had he been able to create a weapon that could satisfy her, something that no smith had ever been able to do before. That said, this was an offer that was still valid even now, so Welf used this challenge as a way to express his true feelings. If he was able to make a weapon that could truly meet her expectations, then as a reward, Welf would make her his. Hephaestus could only laugh, as this was something that she'd heard many times before. And although none had ever been able to do it, perhaps Welf could actually be the person who does. But even if he was, Hephaestus still wanted to sway him from the idea of being with her. She didn't think that there was anything for him to gain from it. Plus, she didn't want him to have to deal with a person whose face was so disfigured. Remember, that was the one thing that Hephaestus was always self-conscious about. No matter who it was, god or human, they would always cringe at the sight of her true face. It was because of this that she didn't want to have to see Welf do the same. So, as she turned to walk away, Welf grabbed her by the shoulder, turned her around, and quickly removed her eye patch. After seeing her entire face, the only thing that he could say was meh. This wasn't something that bothered him at all. In fact, it would take much more than a disfigured face to abate the feelings that he currently felt for her. Although it was definitely a shock to see Welf make such a bold move, Hephaestus couldn't help but grin at his unyielding determination. Now, it was after a few days that Welf's daring declaration would become common knowledge among the gods, making it the leading factor towards him being given the alias of Ignis. With that bringing us to the end of Chapter 3, the last story that I wanted to focus on was Chapter 1. A love song to a certain war god. On one of the nights during the war, Mikoto was dreaming of a memory from her past. A memory from before she had even become part of Takemikazuchi's familia. In this dream, she found herself to be sitting alone at the base of a tree, her face buried into her knees. It was clear from her position alone that something was bothering her. So when Takemikazuchi came to ask what was wrong, Mikoto responded with a question of her own. She wanted to know why she didn't have any parents, a question to which her current self already knew the answer to. You see, it wasn't uncommon for children in the Far East to lose their parents and be left as orphans. There were just so many plagues, monsters, and all-around disasters. So Takemikazuchi had to explain that her parents had left and gone to heaven. Of course, Mikoto was too young at the time to fully understand what that meant. The only thing that she was able to understand was that she'd never see them again. When Takemikazuchi saw the unbearable loneliness that this girl was feeling, it led him to go and make a proposal. He wanted Mikoto to let him become her father figure. He hoped that one day he would be able to bestow this girl with his Falna. That way one day the two of them could share a bond equal to that of a true family. Perhaps that could bring some relief to the little girl whose soul was filled with only pain. And that's exactly what it did. When Mikoto felt the tenderness of these words, she quickly became overcome with joy, as this was the same familial love that she was longing for. So it was after this day that Takemikazuchi would become her father, caring for her the exact same way that any other loving parent would. It was somewhere along the way though that Mikoto's love for him grew into something a bit more special. Upon waking up from this memory, the story progresses into more of a day-in-the-life type experience, showing what Mikoto and Haruhime were doing now that they were part of the Hestia Familia. The main event though was the upcoming annual celebration for Takemikazuchi. On this day, it was fairly common for Mikoto and the others to present him with a gift. So this year they decided to give him a cake. But the cake they got didn't really make it very far. While everyone was enjoying themselves at Mia's pub, Mikoto became jealous by Take's unintentionally suggestive behavior with all the other women, eventually leading her to smash that cake right in his face. Of course, Take didn't understand why this was, but Naza was kind enough to open his eyes a bit. So when his day of celebration finally came, Mikoto had planned to give him another cake to make up for her outburst. But before she could, she found that everyone was already at the Hestia mansion. You see, this day wasn't only meant to celebrate Takemikazuchi, it was also intended to be a going-away party for Mikoto. Because of this, Takemikazuchi went and got her a gift as well. But he first apologized for the night before, then promised to listen to anything she wanted to say to him, sort of prompting her to speak on how she truly felt. But before she could say anything, Take decided to give her her gift first. Much like Hestia, Take had taken a loan out to get her a pair of short swords named Chizan and Tenka, one male and one female. For now, she was only given the female sword Chizan. But Take promised that upon her return to his familia that Tenka would be there waiting for her. So it was kind of like a promise of her coming back to him. A promise to wait as long as was needed to for that moment to come. Since it was now a certainty that she would return to him, Mikoto decided to hold off on confessing her feelings until then. To her, it was enough to know that Take would wait for her. It filled her with the same joy that she felt the day that he offered to become her family. Now, there was one thing that Naza picked up on that Take likely didn't. For a god to split up a pair of male and female blades just like how Take did, well, that was the same thing as giving Mikoto an engagement ring. So Take had essentially proposed to her. We're not sure whether Mikoto or Take realized that this was what this meant, but Mikoto was certainly a lot happier now than how she'd been the days before. She had finally been able to make up with the god of the familia that she left behind, bringing us to the end of Chapter 1. Now, Chapter 2 was a story involving Lily getting a marriage proposal from Finn. Finn basically wanted to create a pureblood Prum heir, one that would become a top-ranked adventurer. He wanted them to continue to be a shining beacon of hope to all Prums just like he was, and he felt that Lily's innate courage would do well to be passed on to his child. Obviously, Lily declined, but the gist of the story was to get Belle to show Lily just how important she truly was to him. Then, Chapter 4 was a story involving Aina, the least important out of all of them, as the entire thing can be summed up as it was just a prank bro. Basically, two adventurers who had fallen in love with Aina had been convinced by their gods that the best way to show that love was to stalk her. This led Aina to hire Belle as her bodyguard. It's only at the end that we find out that the gods who told their children to stalk Aina did so for their own personal entertainment. So that was pretty much everything you missed from the final arc of Season 2. Obviously, the most important stuff came from the story with Siru, but it was still great to learn more about Mikoto and Welf as well. Now we can go into Season 3 with a bit more understanding on what's going on with characters aside from Belle. Speaking of which, if you want to see weekly cut content for Season 3 similar to like how we did for ReZero, then be sure to leave a like and let me know in the comments. It probably won't be as in-depth as ReZero, but I will try to fill in as many of the gaps as possible. Anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!